Hey, gang, welcome back for another comic book interview. Kieran Gillen has been making waves in all kinds of different areas, both independent and work for hire in terms of the comic book industry. He's done high profile work on the X-Men, Thor, and now the Eternals, but also has huge creator owned hits in terms of Phonogram, The Wicked and the Divine, and Die. We talk at length about his start, his influences, and the kinds of things that have helped motivate him along his career. I know you're going to get a lot out of it. Kieran, it has been a while. How are you, sir?
I'm okay. I'm all the better for speaking to you, Jim.
Oh, thanks, man. I appreciate it. I've been talking to a bunch of different people in the industry about, their origin in comics and all the that kind of typical stuff. And I always find it interesting to see how those influences kind of filter through to their work now, and then talking about the form. I've only talked to a handful of writers on these interviews, although over the years, you and I have chatted quite a bit. So I'm really looking forward to kind of diving in a little bit deeper on your career and the things that you've done, because your work is amazing and you've been doing some amazing stuff.
Thank you. That's really kind.
So how, rolling it way back, what are the first kind of comics that you kind of recall, the ones that really grabbed your attention when you were younger?
Like, so it's a weird thing. Like, I'm not a comics lifer. That's the thing that
Oh,
like
really?
a lot of people. Yeah. Like, I mean, I read comics as a kid.
Sure.
The way I normally cheat is by saying that I only got into comics in my mid-20s. That's just not true.
Okay.
As in, like, there's always comics around you. I was
Sure,
always comics curious.
But you're saying getting into them, like, more dedicated. Yeah. So you grew up and they were just in the background. They weren't something you were invested in.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is just I grew up in a small town called Stafford, which is like in a Midlands town. There's no comic shop there, so like American comics were especially distant. They were like they were kind of occasionally turned up on shelves, but they weren't reliably on shelves. So like I've read as a kid I read random issues of like the X-Men or whatever.
Right.
And the other ones that were available were like the British comics.
Sure.
And I read, like, I wasn't a big 2000 AD reader. I certainly read some of it, especially later. But it was like when I read all the British comics, it was the ones which were superheroes were basically reprints of the American ones.
Right.
But they weren't like any chronology. So like you were having like 1980s Spider-Man next to like Machine Man next to
so it's just a random smattering of stuff.
Yeah, like 1960s Thor. So basically that kind of we had 3 decades of stuff. So you got to know the characters iconically. You never really got to learn how stuff tied together.
But you weren't collecting them, like even the British books, you weren't collecting them regularly.
I mean, no, I'm saying the British. I subscribe to like Spider-Man. I subscribe to the I mean, if you speak to any British guy of my generation, the British Transformers comics were a big deal, and they also had Marvel stuff. They had like Marvel Universe stuff as the add-on strips. So we had stuff like the Rocket Raccoon as a backup strip to Transformers. Machine Man of 2020. I mean, we had some really quite random cool stuff, and it was like, oh yeah, this is, so all that's, and obviously stuff like the Beano, and I joke that one of my first memories is reading The Bruins, which is a Scottish comic, which is about like a Scottish family, and it's written in dialect. So like I didn't really understand, like as a 4-year-old when I visited my family in Scotland, on my mum's side, is this kind of like train spotting for under fives? It was, So all that's in the mix, and I enjoyed it, but I sort of drifted out of comics. Even like, I mean, point this, I cared about comics enough to try to get hold of the Marvel UK stuff, like the earlier Marvel UK stuff. Like you had weird stuff like Grant Morrison wrote Zoids, like Zoids. Yeah, honestly, like he did and it's very clearly Grant Morrison, and the whole plot becomes like their toys being controlled by extra-dimensional beings.
Man,
like,
that is very
Grant.
Yes.
And it's honestly, it's a proto-Invisibles for like 10-year-olds. But I sort of drifted out in my teenagers just because I was in Stafford. There's no comic shop, so you never really had access to anything else. Like my best mate, he collected comics still, so he went to Birmingham and got them. So occasionally I read stuff like Infinity War, Infinity Gauntlet and stuff like that, just because he had it.
Sure.
And my brother started getting 2000 AD, so that's in the world. And of course, and since I got more into music, this is circa like Watchmen's happened, Dark Knight Returns happened.
Right. Yeah, this early 90s, you're talking Infinity Gauntlet. Yeah.
So all that's kind of, there's like articles about this stuff. So I know it's kind of culturally valid. That's probably a good way. As in, I knew I should have read Watchmen. It was on that list of books which me as a pretentious 15-year-old was like, I should have read this, and I haven't, and now I feel bad. So I was always interested, but it was only really like so I kind of read stuff when I could, and it's like when at 21, I was like waiting when I really started to sort of flirt more towards comics properly, which is I lived in America for like a year. I was part of my degree.
Okay.
I was like, I did a science degree. I was a biologist, so I worked in a lab, like dissecting human brains, as I mentioned on Twitter recently.
Oh, wow.
It's a slight. I dissected the human brain once, and I spent the rest of the time, and I assisted. I didn't get to do the cutting, that's the worst idea. And then I just ran a lot of tests on brain samples. But in that year, before when I was getting my visa, I had to like basically had to do it the last minute and go to London and go to the American embassy and wait to get something signed. And I got there like 3 hours early because the times were weird. So I went to sit in Oxford Street. So I went to the mega store in Oxford Street and saw a copy of Watchmen and bought Watchmen and went to the so I went to the McDonald's on Oxford Street and sat and read Watchmen cover to cover.
Really, in one sitting?
About 3 hours to kill. And it was that kind of, and it was like, completely top of my head taken off. I was very much a different person. Went to America and we didn't have a TV in the flat I was living in. So, and I had only I had a copy of Watchmen and a bunch of very pretentious philosophy books. Yeah, this is a theme, you may have noticed.
I like it. See, so it does all hold true when I say what are the books that influence you and how do they carry through? You're like, well, I have Watchmen and a bunch of philosophy books. So I'm like, oh, okay, here we go. Here's the primordial, soup right there.
Yeah, but I was too depressed to read the philosophy because it was, I'm in America with nothing to do and no car, like in Denver, which I've no problems with Denver, but like it's not a great place to not be able to get around it.
Right.
And so I read Watchmen in that until I got like a TV, which I eventually did. I read Watchmen like 4 or 5 or 6 times in that period, like really intense. And that's kind of like that close reading was kind of like, oh no, there's something really interesting here. And when I got an RPG, I found an RPG group I joined, and one of the slightly older players was a big comic guy, and he lent me a lot. And this is called Circa 97. So like Vertigo have almost like Preacher's well into it, Invisibles is well into it. Ennis's Hellblazer is done, Sandman is done. So he just lends me a bunch of like long boxes, and I work my way through a lot of that kind of stuff. And by the time that year's over, I come back and finish my degree, and I am, the thing like people buy like 1 album a year, like 1 or 2 albums a year. Back in the day, that kind of the guy who buys 1 album, I was that with comics. So like I bought like 2 to 3 graphic novels a year, and it was it was whenever they released an Invisibles trade, whenever they released the Preacher's trade. And this is the stuff that all, like Kill Your Boyfriend and various other bits and pieces they reprinted. And they just sort of left around like my student house. And I remember my fanzines at the time, I completely like, cut and pasted stuff from them and all that stuff. So it's that kind of that low bubbling interest, but not full on until like.
So you were doing fanzines then? That's your sort of entryway into the culture, or?
Yeah, I mean, like, I was a music fan, so these were music fanzines. So like, I was, they're like, I was obviously, as anybody who reads my comics, I was hugely into music, and one of the things I sort of did was just like, actually, the first fanzine I ever did, I was already employed by the games press by then. I'd actually got a job writing for Amiga Power, which was my favorite games magazine ever.
Nice.
Which is. That was for me. That's like being a member of the Beatles. But I played Triangle in the Beatles. I didn't do much, but I definitely got money. But even I was like, I read a book called England's Dreaming by John Savage, which is about history of punk, and that was so hugely influential. And mainly, it was like there's this bit when John Savage is sitting in the toilet at work, and he's basically stolen it, and he's making a fanzine. He's cutting stuff out, and just to get the A bombs in his head out, as he puts it. And immediately I was like, oh, I'm allowed to write. And that was really when I was I didn't, despite I was already a professional writer, I didn't quite realize it was okay for somebody to do that.
Right.
So that was always, so the fanzine became a thing I did. So I made up these A4 sheets and handed them out in nightclubs to people. And then I built up to like doing proper big blocky fanzines. And they were like one of my first bits of collected writing, I guess. Like, and of course I was in bands at the time. So all this stuff ties together. It's like, that level of obsession in a culture. And that kind of came through like when I ended up getting into comics, going to the comic shop every week way. Like I went to my first con and I came back on the night and wrote my first comic script. And like the next con the next year, I'd actually got enough people to draw these strips to have a little zine together.
Nice.
And like and I did these self-published zines. I kind of did me and Alex DeCampi did an anthology together. Like we arranged and printed and paid for.
And what was that called?
Commercial Suicide. Yeah, like
Nice.
don't look it up. This, the and did web comics and all. So it was always it all for me, like going from appreciation to doing it
Mhm,
was always part of the same breath. So like when I did bits of writing about comics as well. So it's like
mhm.
when I fall in love with something, it's like I want to take it apart, and I
Right.
also want to do it by expressing my love for it in that way. So all this sort of stuff ties together.
So the do-it-yourselfer mentality, very much that's, like I see a lot of similarities in the band culture and just sort
Mm,
of, okay, we're making a band and we're doing a thing, and kind of the zine culture and the comic culture where you're just like, yeah, you can make a thing. You just need you, and sometimes it's you and an artist or just 3 people, 4 people, and we're going to do the thing. And that do-it-yourselfer mentality, I think, has so many people's careers start that way. And on the other side of it, people look at the finished, published, greater career, and they go, oh, it's impossible. How could you get there? And you're
mm.
literally like, come up with a story. I know it sounds that simple and that hard, and it is, and you're going to learn by doing as much, if not more, than reading all the theory and watching all the tutorials, for
This
sure.
anytime I teach comics is it's like one of the basic things is try and get something drawn.
Yeah.
And just because immediately you see all your errors.
Hmm.
Like you go, oh no, the artist did that and I asked them to, and that was just wrong.
Right. Or I didn't give enough information, or in my head, I
Yeah.
thought it was going to be like this. And that's why those short stories and anthologies are so valuable, because
Mhm.
you get the learning process. You get to start and finish a thing in a really short span, see how you gel with the artist, see how your own communication translates through, and
Mm.
go, oh, we could do more with either this concept or another concept, or we've kind of gotten a bunch of those mistakes out of the way. I feel like a lot of people, they want to run the marathon before they've even done, walk around the block. Like they just, oh, they've got these big, long, epic ideas. And it's like, that's cool, but you got to test drive. You got to, get a feel for how this stuff functions.
I mean, like that was my first ones are like these little 3 to 5 page short stories. In fact, the
Yeah.
first comics I did were they were all called hit. I call it
Okay.
basically I basically used each short story is based around a different definition of the word hit.
Nice.
And they are of variable quality, like shall we say, and also but the quality mainly being terrible. But
Sure. But
that's not what they were for.
yeah,
They were
exactly.
like, yeah, and they were
Yeah, my
definitely kind of
web
me.
comic was the exact same thing, figuring stuff out. And I was drawing it as well. So it was like, oh, page layout and flow. And like, you
Mm,
don't know any of those things to start. I was teaching myself Photoshop because it wasn't a standard when I was going to school. The whole digital part of it was all pretty new to me. And so those kinds of things as well. I feel like that development period, people don't talk about it very much because they're embarrassed by it, or they feel like oh, it's not good. It's not good. It's like, no one's as good. You don't have, it's like, no one in a band or a professional musician is going to brag about doing scales. They're not going to brag about
mm,
practicing the absolute basics, and yet it's crucial, right? That's the thing.
I'll tell you one of the things I did actually. I remember describing this to Andy McDonald. I must have been still be doing it quite late. I described it as minor but serious work. And but what it was, I did photo comics.
Yeah.
Amongst the other thing, I did a web comic called Negative Land, which had about 260 pages by the end of it.
Oh wow, that's great.
So it's like it's a sizable body of work. It's not. I'm not going to slag it off too much.
You guys might say it's not good. Yeah, yeah.
Well, it's obviously not good. But what
Sure.
it was like I couldn't realize none of my. I don't know. A mate of mine, Jim Rossignol, who's game design and runs a company called Big Robot now, and we co-did Ludocrats together. But he
Mhm.
said, I'm doing this website. It's a sort of like communal sort of like creativity site. So he wanted to basically encourage all his friends, no matter what they love, to do stuff. And I was always the person who, me and Jim were partners in crime. So yes, I'll do you a comic.
Right.
And I'm like, okay. And the first one I did was I just through clip art, found, just editing stuff. I'm doing a comic that way. The second one was, okay, photo comic. Except clearly I'm not going to be able to talk my friends to posing enough.
Right.
Like, why would I? So I'm going to take the camera and take photos as I'm going around my daily life and go clubbing. And it's mainly clubbing then because I was in my early 20s or mid 20s by then. And whatever photos I have at the end of the 2-week period, I'm going to turn into a story, which is
Nice.
also I gave a setting, as in the story was basically it was a reality TV show with 500 people put on an island and there's cameras everywhere, and the island is called very clearly the town I live called Bath. So it's like these people who are just here, kind of, and just it's mainly talk about how incestuous Bath felt because it's a even smaller town than Stafford, and how everyone is in each other's stuff and that. And it's called Negative Land because all the photos. So the photos are terrible, so I just inverted them all.
Right.
Yeah, and so but
suddenly it's artistic, right?
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely incredible. But the thing that doing that was basically always, how can I make a bloody comic out of this?
Sure.
And that's the thing that taught me. I said, not that any of them is particularly good, but it's always kind of like, okay, how am I solve this problem?
But you're also talking about hundreds of pages of material
Mm.
that you're going through that learning process and that building process and that narrative process, right? And so,
Yeah.
you know, whatever manner of quality you look back at now, it still teaches you in this really nice way where, you know, the stakes are low and you're able to sort of experiment and, oop, that didn't work, or, oh, that's cool, or whatever, and come out the other side a stronger storyteller for it.
Oh no, absolutely. There's some random cool stuff in there. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
stuff like
Yeah.
it's clearly in that very low level. Also, I mean, I can't draw. My drawing is not sufficient enough to do most stories.
Right.
But finding the stories I could tell with the photos I had,
Mhm.
you know, like, and that was
No,
one of the
you're
things-
giving yourself limitations. And then by that very nature, you know, people ask me, they go, do you prefer creator owned or commercial work? And it's like, you can say creator owned, obviously, because it's a free reign for you to do whatever you want. But there is something really exciting about being given limits and then finding something cool within those limits, or breaking through new areas within established parameters and kind of surprising the client and yourself and kind of going, hey, what about this? You know, there's something fun about building on those existing structures as well. And I like my you know, opt-out answer is both. Like, they flex different creative muscles for me. And so you creating your own limitations and saying, look, I've got these photos, I'm going to make a story out of it. There's a framework there to build off of, instead of just anything goes, which I think, you know, sort of screws people up, where they're like, well, you can do anything. Oh, I don't know what to do. Where you're like, okay, place limits on yourself. How often were you releasing this? Was it regularly scheduled, or was it just
bi-weekly?
sort of
Not bi-weekly. Every American. I always get confused with American. North American and British bi-weekly.
Yeah.
Every 2 weeks we put out a strip of
Nice.
a number of pages.
Nice.
I'll lob you a handful of pages if you're going to throw some stuff in this.
Absolutely, I would love to put these up at the same time.
The lettering is amazing. The lettering,
I'm sure it is, right?
It's clearly like, I don't care. As in, you can tell that I literally, like, I'm just putting this stuff on the page because this is the point. These are narrative sketches,
right?
So,
cool, but these are cool, and they're you're self-starting all these little projects. And again, I think that's a real commonality. People will say, how do you break in? How do you do this stuff? And I feel like so much of it is you have to start making things. You have to start finishing things, and then being able to see them in the rearview mirror and go, okay, what have we learned? What can we improve upon? What little networks? And you've already got friends you're meeting in the club scene and artists that you're meeting along the way. And so how do you make that sort of transition then from this kind of zine culture and things like that to starting to do more formalized work?
That's really tricky, because it's like, one of the things I often think about is, like, all my work tends to be a calling card for the next work, and I don't mean that coldly, but that kind of, like, even when I did my first, I talked someone to do this 5-page story, and we put that online, and it was what I haven't mentioned, like, the bit where I came in hard in comics was via the Warren Ellis Forum, which of course is really hard to talk about now with the whole history around that, and it's like,
but I think it's, I mean, obviously in a historical context, that forum was hugely influential on a large group of creators. And so, yes, obviously in the modern context, it's difficult to talk about it because of the controversy now, but it's still a forming ground, a proving ground for a bunch of people. Yeah.
Oh no, definitely. I mean, like, it's the sort of thing that, like, obviously everything is continuing there, and, you know, I'm just very, that you're sitting and waiting to see actually what ends up happening, and the things people have talked about, and but at the same time, it is such a, you know, it was an influential period for lots of people, right? And now, of course, you're looking through what that place was like through their very different eyes.
Yes,
it is,
yes.
So, like, especially with my own, that I came expressly from, I like people like Fraction or Charlie Chu talking about what comics they were reading, but like how I learned about it was my liberal education. Like, I didn't know about comics, so going there and
they were telling you this book is cool, and so you seek it out.
Yeah, exactly. You know, that kind of that period only books, like how much I was into that. You know, you can see that with a lot of the stuff me and Jamie did. And that's how I met Jamie eventually. Actually, this actually segues back to the question.
Yeah.
Like Jamie, I was selling my zine. I was showing a table with a couple of other people, and he the zine on the table, Never Mind the Comics was Ali Pulling's zine, but a bunch of other people did stuff, including Jamie. Jamie came to the table trying to find Ali. Ali was not there, and we just chatted briefly. He showed me his portfolio, and apparently I instantly said, "Hey, I've got an idea for a comic called Phonogram. You should do." And that's literally like, and in my head, it's funny because in my head I don't remember saying that. In my head, I thought I was being sneakier, as in that's what I thought was thinking. I seduced him over the next 6 months. But in the case of I just absolutely just splurted it out because I saw that he was reading very clearly. He was reading the same books I was.
Right.
It is like he was very influenced by like China Clugston and and Steve Ralston and those kind of like that kind of, and he really understood fashion and he understood how people. They were basically the first page of Suburban Glamour, which is a story that Jamie did by himself in between his first 2 phonograms, which he redrew it like 3 times, I think, like those first few pages. And it was immediately like, I wouldn't say, oh, I knew I'd found my muse. It's like, oh, you find someone who is gelling with you. And you mentioned the BAM stuff earlier, that kind of like, oh no, your aesthetics and my aesthetics, I think we can do business. And in terms of like going from the zine scene, I mean, the thing is like comics are this, for me, there is that permeability to it. Like there's definitely people who I was on my scene with who started to pitch at comic companies earlier than I did. And I think like multiple years, like I was like, because I thought I just wasn't good enough. Right. My kind of thing, I was like, I wanted to sit and chew over until I knew I was competent. Because in my head, it was like, there's no real point to breaking in if I'm immediately kicked out again for being crap.
So, but you also have no way of measuring that, that quality level or being able to say, okay, now I am as good or better than what's out there. Like it's hard to put so many people want to come into an art form, I think fully formed. They want to be Athena appearing as an adult from the head of Zeus, right? They want to be the perfect golden thing, not realizing warts and all, you've got to go through that kind of development process. But you have gone through the development process, but you still feel like there's this barrier you don't want to cross until. Yeah.
I mean, for me, it was definitely a kind of like, I knew I wanted my first book to feel like.
Sure.
And it was that kind of like, I need to train for what this thing has to be. And I was like,
which is a good mentality as long as it doesn't paralyze you. Yeah.
Yeah. That was I remember there's one thing I remember reading that, oh my God, my brain's gone blank. Mike Carey was writing about in terms of Mike Carey believes he didn't break in for far too long because he was a bit hung up on a variety of the stuff we were talking about.
Yeah.
I always remember there's a gaming thing, which is like, I think it's gaming. One way to get good is, get your stuff published and then be bad.
Right.
It's like the pressure is a great way to develop yourself as well. So between those,
a real deadline, all of a sudden you're like, I can't mess around anymore. I've got to put this in, you can't just noodle with it. I've known way too many people over the years who say they have an idea they want to pursue, and that can be comics or any kind of creative pursuit, gaming or video games or art or whatever. And they're always moving that goalpost further and further out. They're like, well, they'll noodle around with logos and character designs and concept art, and they'll do treatments. And you're just like, at some point, page 1, panel 1 needs to happen. Otherwise, you're never going to get it off the ground, Yeah.
I must admit, I agree. You sort of, the fact I do projects at least kind of limits me a bit. I'm always doing stuff.
Yeah.
But there's this bit of like, I'm trying to remember, when did I ever consciously think about breaking in? And that's the tricky thing, because I was always like art for art's sake kind of person. Yeah, that was my kind of approach. Yeah,
was it the forums that was it Warren Ellis forums that turned into a more formalized, oh, I've got an outlet, or I feel like I'm in this grouping? Or
I wouldn't say I did it passively, but this thing with Phonogram, like Jamie with Phonogram, when I first said that I've got this idea for a comic, I think that was 2003. Phonogram comes out in 2006. And like, I think, because what the position was like, I'd done these little 5-page comics, and I'd done some comics which were in the same world, and I went from these 5-page ideas to 5-page short stories set in the same world.
Right.
So I did some of them, and I'd done this like, a couple of things which were larger. So I'm like getting increasingly ambitious.
Yeah.
But with Phonogram, I always think it was going to be my zine. It was going to be like a zine. It'd be like 20 pages, and it'd be like, proper black and white indie comic, as in proper indie, not like coming through Image or anything, proper indie photocopy stuff. Because that's where we were in 2003.
Right.
And as we kind of carried on in the scene, we got a bit better, and we started doing like stuff like official PlayStation magazine. We did that monthly comic strip for like 5 years almost.
Sorry, which magazine is this?
Official PlayStation magazine UK.
Nice.
Save Point, we did 49 episodes. So actually, not
wow.
So 4 years of it then.
Holy mackerel, that's a lot.
Yeah, we were going to quit at 50, and then they fired us at 49. And it's like,
isn't that always the way? Yeah.
How dare they? And I remember when I was originally asked to do this Save Point, they gave us an idea. This is the sort of comic strip we want, and I sort of said, I reckon there's probably a year's worth of funny ideas in that concept. Yeah, me and Jamie will do it. And we do it for 4 years, but simultaneously prove they were actually right. There was probably about 12 good ideas in there.
Recycled and refurbished. Yeah.
But the sort of the point is, we're on the scene more. We are doing work in that period. We're doing work and bits and pieces and meeting people and people seeing our stuff. Jamie does a book with Eric Stevenson. I mean, what was it called? It was a 1980s mod story. I forgot what it was called. But he also works as art assistant for like an American artist for like a summer. So that, and also there's a broader way. Business forums or other places and being around. Also, we're doing stuff and people are seeing us doing stuff.
Yeah.
And we kind of got to the point where like, when we were going to start doing Phonogram, we realized that no, this is probably good enough to be pitched to somebody. And so we did. There was that kind of like I don't think we put it off too long. I think we definitely like Phonogram Rue Britannia is like it's raw and messy in dozens of ways, but it's definitely a book with a voice and stuff to say.
Right. And I think that's a really, as much as you were worried about making that mark or being that, making a bad first impression, if you will, on a larger audience, I think that voice came through, and there's an energy there, and there's an atmosphere there, and there's a sense of ambition that delivers. And that's the thing, that it's like it's never going to be perfect, but that's kind of, you still needed to move past that point.
It's funny, like I've just realized I've sort of lied a bit, because when I said like you don't want to be kicked out, like that, I wasn't planning to break into comics. Like that's me using my advice from later in my career, giving people advice. What I I just wanted to do, my motivation is always just to try to get a shelf full of books I'm proud of. You know what I mean? And it was explicit. I think we're okay now, as in to do. I'm okay with the book I'm doing, and I know it won't, because I'd worked in magazines for like since I got my first work in '95, but I'd been working full time since '98. So I knew nothing's ever perfect in this way. So that kind of stuff was never a problem for me. But like the idea of, we can take a swing and do something. So we were pitching it to Oni, I think, and then we showed it. Actually, I showed the demo page to Laura McCubbin, who was an art director at Image at the time, now the awesome professor. And she said, "Why the hell aren't you pitching this at us?" So we did.
Nice.
And Eric said yes. And that's the only easy thing about Phonogram. You know what I mean? And suddenly, like, it was a nightmare. The pitch process was really easy. But like,
when you say it was a nightmare, was it pressure you were putting on yourself? Was it the production deadlines? What made it so difficult? Was it trying to top yourself, or what? Like,
I mean, the work was hard, but I've made a weird. None of my, apart from actually even Ludicrous, who made a lot of work, but my Image books are always deliberately a lot of hard work. I've clearly read a load of books for them. It's not like Once and Future I did for Boom. That's fun time. I've maybe read 3 or 4 books for that. And it's me and Dan and Tamara like just having fun. Whilst the Image books are like I am thinking. So that's hard. But that's the job.
Why do you think that is? Is it is it an expectation you're putting on yourself? Like, this has to be a pure distillation of my philosophies, my ideas?
Yes, that nonsense. So like, it's absolutely like it's my technical term, my bullshit mugging myself. You know what I mean? So that and
you can't blame it on an editor or a publisher. They're like, oh, they're watering me down. You can't expect the pure stuff, and then they're coming for the pure stuff. You're like, well, I better give them the pure stuff. Yeah.
But like, so that was there, but that's kind of what I wanted. Yeah. I mean, the real problem was just trying to make sure money. Trying to work out why Jamie can eat. And the basic structure of having to do this book.
Right. So I know a lot of Image books, the writer becomes sort of the de facto project manager, accountant. And that's not saying it has to work that way, but was that the way with your books?
Yeah. I mean, I was not everything. Sure. Drew at Image did the design stuff.
Yeah.
But like you know, I actually occasionally think that I was Jamie's personal assistant for like 10 years. And that's slightly exaggerating it.
No, I get it though. I too. Like on Wayward, it was very much the same kind of thing. Like I've got to keep Steven working these 5 years that we did Wayward together, you know, keeping the boat afloat. Like got to keep this thing coming in every single time and make sure that I'm delivering something I'm proud of, but also the regularity of it is pushing you to solve problems and get stuff done, you know?
Yeah. I think that's one of the things that like it's I think that's one of the things anybody, especially people like Marvel, they're aware how hard it is to do an indie book.
Yeah.
So it's doing an indie book, and you doing an indie book like that is a calling card. It also, remember that, you know, the old thing can say about degrees, that degrees only really prove you can do a degree.
Right.
Like doing an indie book proves you're capable of socializing with a human being and arranging them for a period of, you know what I mean? But
yeah, you've got something as good or better than what's being put out by these major publishers with these huge systems, and you're doing it on your own, and you're forcing that through the pipeline and coming out the other side with something, you know, extremely professional. That is a calling card, absolutely. You know, let alone doing it regularly. Yeah.
No, I always tried Phonogram. I don't know about you. Like I always tried Phonogram on my cool black and white indie movie.
Yeah.
You know, that's the kind of the thing. But the other reason why you do it, and I don't know about you, is the reason why I take so much other stuff on in that period was I didn't want Jamie to be distracted anymore. Because like if Jamie, the problem with doing a comic is the artist drawing the pages. And if Jamie is answering an email, Jamie is not drawing a page. I mean, obviously Jamie isn't just sitting and drawing a page.
Sure.
But removing anything that's distracting.
Yeah.
Is kind of the supportive thing. I kind of like I still kind of like see that. I mean, I work with editors now on my indie books, so it's not quite as much.
Sure.
But there's a lot about trying to make sure your artist is comfortable and happy, and that's partially ethical, but it's also like practical because people do better work when they're happy.
Of course. And it's, you know, it is a working relationship. Like you are attached at the hip for that production period, particularly on the indie books where you are their support system, you know, their feedback, all those kinds of things. And in many ways, you're also, you know, it's not a clear, just one-way pipeline of script. It's also the constant discussions of what do you want and what do you like, and is this cool? Are we going in the direction that we want? You know what I mean? Yeah. And that constantly evolving as you go. I remember the first arc of Wayward ends in a very, when I originally wrote it, it was a very standard kind of, okay, we got the gang all together. And I was like, well, that's too neat a bow to tie. I want to bust it up, and no, they're not going to get together. Everything's going to be all messed up. And I'm literally calling up Steven and I go, yeah, just ignore those last 8 pages. I'm going to rewrite them. And he's like, what? And I'm like, no, it's going to be better. And I'm trying to explain, but also I want to get back to writing. And so I'm just like, just ignore that stuff. We're going to kill this person and wreck that thing. And he's just like, oh, okay. You know, trust in what's going forward. I love that kind of stuff though, because that's so much harder to do on the commercial work. It's so much harder to suddenly take a swerve, you know, because they're like, you sent us an outline. You're like, yeah, just ignore that, you know.
That was just a distract. That was just to talk you into hiring me.
Yeah, that's right. That was the approval process. I still love hearing that story about Kirkman when he pitched Walking Dead to Jim Valentino. And Valentino's like, it's just a zombie story. And he goes, oh, yeah, no, we're going to find out they're actually aliens that have created the zombie virus. And Valentino's like, oh, yeah, that's a good hook. And then they get done, I think like 10 or 12 issues. And Valentino's like, where's the aliens? And he goes, yeah, no, we're not doing that. I just needed you to approve it, which is just so
I love that story. It's like that is genuinely beautiful.
Yeah, that is so Robert though. When you talk to him, he's just like this smirking kid who got away with the piggy bank or whatever. It's amazing.
That is great.
Awesome. So Phonogram happens. It's not like instantly your phone's ringing off the hook. What is the transition? Right. What is the transitional period there then?
I mean, the joke is like Phonogram. Phonogram doesn't prove you can write anything but Phonogram. It's not like everyone's going, I'm going to put them on the Britpop magician book, you know, like, because it's not even got much of a story. It's just, you know what I mean? It's just it's a thing. Right. And people liked it, you know.
Oh, sure. It's atmosphere and it's character and it's emotional, but it's not a clean, simple beginning, middle, end narrative. Right.
Yeah. I mean, like, I got, what happened in the orders? I'm literally going for the order of how we were about setting up doing Phonogram 2. Like Jamie did Suburban Glamour and Phonogram 2 was happening. This is our kind of, and I'm just moving to London. So that was a wonderful time because we were putting out these books to begin with, mostly monthly. Then it sort of fell apart a bit because the book made no money. Even less money than the first. It was really exciting. By which I mean awful. Actually, we held launch parties every issue as well, which is generally like it had a wonderful scene. But at the same time, like I'm getting around a bit. I get recommended to a few places. I mean, Marvel did actually Robin Ellis is doing a book called Universal, and they want to do some spin-offs. And Warren apparently said yes, if only you could like pick the creators. And I was one of the people he picked to write it. So I did this book from Marvel called 1959, which is kind of like a James Ellroy superhero story. And I do that, and then my phone starts ringing. Yeah, because it's one of these things like, oh right, you can do superheroes. Right. Because the whole thing has got a real big serious, it's very unlike Phonogram in that, stuff happens and it's entertaining. But like there's bits where people come through the wall and the superhero stuff, but it's also got a kind of grim, very clear attitude. And then like the X office and the 4 office at the time contact me and ask me, you interested in trying to do this one shot it was like a Sabretooth story in the X office, like Nick Lowe. And over in the 4 office, it's a Beta Ray Bill, like one. Right. Actually, it was a Dazzler story. That was actually an 8-page Dazzler story. Was the first thing in the X office. I lie. Amazing. And I do them, and apparently don't mess them up, and they offer me more work. And that's the kind of, I said earlier, the kind of the calling card aspect. It was that, and that was definitely my door in at Marvel. And I kind of just carried on playing that gambling machine, and they let me do stuff in that way. Nice. And then at the same time, Avatar. Avatar were kind of like looking for me. They came to me. We've got some ideas to develop. You interested in doing it? And the Avatar, paid a pretty good work for hire comic rate for like somebody who was just getting going. Yeah. So I did that as well. Nice. And so were you exclusive at Marvel for a while? Eventually, yeah. When like 2010. I mean, that's kind of like after a series of books that went, like people liking me, and I ended up taking over 4 from JMS, which was something of a poison chalice, because that whole situation was quite like hard at the time, like, tumultuous, and like while I was taking over this very critically acclaimed book, that sold a lot, and I had to I had no idea where JMS was going to be ending it, so I basically had to work out every possible path he could have taken in his final issue, and then wrap up his stories in like 3 issues and get them back to Broxton in time for the Siege crossover. Right. Which I was going to write 2 issues during. So it ended up being like 6 issues, that bit. So I did a lot of plan, did it. And then it got expanded by another issue. Then it got expanded by 2 tie-ins. Then it got expanded by another 4 issues. And this is all just literally no warning. Oh, do you want to do this? So it ended up being like this 13-issue run. And the weird thing about it is it carries on selling. Like it's that kind of like it had every possibility to be a complete mess, but like in extremis, I managed to sort of like do this. Right. You're throwing down the train tracks as the train is driving over. Yeah, it's definitely it's an amazing bit of animation, and it was a lot of fun, and I learned a lot from doing it, even though it was a weird nightmare. Sure. And that I think is the thing that made Marvel think, oh no, this guy's. I mean, that was definitely a jump in my career because I went from that to writing the X-Men. Right. And that was very much like, oh right. He can handle a lot of, he's somebody who's handled a lot of troubles and made something that actually sold and was fine. The X-Men, that's the book for him. Nice. If there's anything that's a book that's trouble and constantly having problem solving and is a bit of a poison chalice, the Uncanny X-Men. That's the one. And like honestly, and I never mind that. My problem's always if the job changes is always the problem. Yeah. If I go in and know what the job is, like, no, that's what I signed up for, and actually what I find interesting. It's always the kind of when something warps beneath you, that's when I feel like bad. But like the X-Men, it was always like, this is an interesting series of problems I can deal with. Let's do this. Right. And so you went in very much with this problem solver mentality. Especially because, I knew AVX, I knew like in 12 issues time, there's this big crossover called Schism, which happened. And then I knew like 12 issues after that, there'll be Avengers versus X-Men. So Avengers versus X-Men being a crossover, starring the X-Men, and I'm not writing that crossover. Right. So you're just sort of clearing and fixing and organizing and then sending it off. Contextualizing. Yeah. And so it was like I'm always between the raindrops. And what I ended up doing was, okay, they are big narrative, my personal solution was I'm going to lean into it.
Yeah.
Like those 12 issues leading up to AVX are basically, I want the readers to want the X-Men to fight the Avengers by this point.
Right.
And Schism is all my sub 4 Schism is about the increasing tension between the various sides. I absolutely, what could have been a problem was this isn't my story prompt.
Right.
Like, this is obviously, I can't argue with this, and I don't, if I try to argue against it, it's going to make the book bad because it's going to fall apart the second the crossover hits. So instead, I'm going to say what themes are interesting. And for me, like, when eventually I wrote Darth Vader, it was almost similar in that, I'm
well, there's established moments of the character that are immutable. Yeah.
How did they get? What's the most interesting way to dramatize the journey between these points? Right, and especially because there's always extra meat, which the other stuff, in the case of Darth Vader, it's like we've never seen him discover his son. We've never seen him recover his power after the Death Star. That's really good story stuff. And in the case of X-Men, there's similar stuff, and it's always there's always other stuff which is really interesting, and
particularly with such an eclectic cast that almost never gets the spotlight. Like, you can only have one Cyclops issue out of however many issues, or sure, Wolverine's got his ongoing series, but what about Dazzler? What about all these other characters that need those moments? I think that was one of those things that when I was going to be doing Champions, I just wanted to have like a sense of that ongoing storyline, the serialized sort of format. And I reread Uncanny X-Men, the Claremont stuff. Yeah. And I was so impressed with how deftly some of it is done, where he's constantly feeling like he's evolving these characters, moving them forward, and then shifting the spotlight to another character, giving them these really meaty emotional stuff that will resonate for a while, and then tilting back to someone else and just ping-ponging off all these characters, and then introducing someone new or throwing a new paradigm shift for someone in there. And it just feels like the ongoing soap opera of these amazing characters. And when he leaves, I think, the office gets nervous about making those big swings, or unsure of how to keep that kind of shambling monstrosity kind of moving forward, and trying to find new ways to solve those kinds of problems. Exactly the kind of stuff you're talking about.
Yeah. So, it's really, like when I took over X-Men, in my head, it was like I was taking over writing Breaking Bad in season 4. Right. Because like there's been if I was going to step back and sort of say, I think one of the most impressive pieces of work for hire writing, at the most corporate level, is the continuing story of Cyclops in the late noughties into the early 2010s. Because it's a very, very long, slow story about a man's taking steps towards hell. And it's like, by the end, he gets to the point where he thinks, logically, I have to kill Professor X. And that's not even out of character by this point. There's no, we've got there one step at a time. And it's no one writer, but they've managed to. And that's, that's not something I think very often happens in work for hire. They have, despite not having a visionary, visionary is a loaded word. But, without someone like Hickman as a magnetic north, sure, the office somehow managed to turn that into hold that together. So actually, it was I thought I had enormous advantages in that because they'd done the work properly in quotation marks in the previous 4 years. Right. So I got to pay off all their good stuff. Nice. But it's weird, because I was also aware that I wasn't writing it completely in a Claremont mode. Because the working title for my X-Men run in my head was, I put it on a couple of documents, and the Uncanny X-Men, Earth's Mightiest Heroes, which is completely as come at me, bro. And I was writing it the X-Men in the procedural superhero model. Like the Avengers tends to be written at like a workplace structure, instead of being a family, these are people who go to a workplace and do something together, and there's obviously soap stuff there. I think it's because so many of the Avengers characters have solo books, and so it has to feel like this is where we come together to superhero as opposed to come together to be people, right? Yeah. So although that's not true, like there's a whole secondary cast of Avengers who only get to flex in the Avengers books, your Vision, your Scarlet Witch, or in your classic days, Hawkeye, in outside of a few miniseries and solo bits. But it's like most of the character development for those characters has to happen in the team book in the classic era. And now I don't know that that's necessarily the case. It feels like it's a lot more catch where catch can kind of stuff. Yeah, it's definitely like that kind of reinvention of what a team book is. Because I think I did a rant about this recently about the difference between team books and ensemble casts. Yeah. And like team books, like almost like team books are the book the team is about they get together and do the thing.
Yeah, well,
You know,
because a lot of them have the solo series that you have to acquiesce to, right? Like you
yeah,
can't have the super important Captain America plotline happening in Avengers because what's the solo book there for? Do you know what I mean? And so it's
yeah.
this weird kind of tug of war. Whereas X-Men, the vast majority of the characters is the X-Men in that team book. So you can have the big swings, the big
Mm,
emotional payoffs in the book every time, you know?
yeah.
Yeah.
It's definitely like also. I mean, the like Jason was doing Wolverine and the X-Men at the same time, which is the
Mhm.
school book. It was like very much character led, and like
Yeah.
led me to like I occasionally saw my X-Men was like the authority. You know what I mean?
Right.
These are very, very powerful people doing missions and being like and having and the character stuff is much more integrated in what they're doing.
Mhm.
And like, there's quite a lot of, you know, the character stuff is really important there, but it's always character stuff you don't see much downtime, which is
Yeah.
you know, and I love downtime. You know, a lot of my stuff is like that. But the
Yeah.
idea of this big shiny X-Men being those kind of noughties model like noughties model superheroes was really
Yeah,
fun
I
to
think,
me.
you know,
Yeah.
it's one of those things that because there's this feeling that everything has to be important and every page, like the readers needs to be totally, you know, stimulated for lack of a better term. Like I feel like people are afraid of downtime moments. They're afraid of quiet moments. And yet, if I think about some of my favorite X-Men moments growing up, I love, there's one issue, it's a Paul Smith drawn issue where Kitty Pryde is showing Peter, she's got a new power they can walk through. She can like levitate and she like covers his eyes and they walk up through the floor and they
Mm.
end up in Storm's kind of attic loft area, and she gives him a kiss, and it's like this. That whole scene is so sweet and so cute and fun. The other one I love is this is like Magneto's on trial, and Kitty and Wolverine are sitting on the steps outside the courthouse, and she's complaining and he's just chugging a cigar, and finally she goes, give me that, and she takes a big puff of it, and then she starts choking and crying and all this kind of stuff, and it breaks up this very rant that she's having, you know. I love that. I thought those were fun and silly and great moments. Or, you know, yes, Wolverine's wedding and all that stuff, but there's that great moment where Madeline Pryor realizes that Kitty's got a pet dragon, and because Kitty hands her the dragon and says, hey, will you look after Lockheed for me? And she assumes it's a cat, and she looks down, and then she looks at Scott and she goes, who are these people, or something like that. It's just like those are these sweet little quiet moments and fun moments and silly things that I think, you know, people don't, people really appreciate, even if you look at it and you go, well, you're not making good use of the page. You're like, yeah, if I make you care about these people, if I make you love them, then I perfectly use the page. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
I always think about what Brian was doing to the Avengers in the noughties. And, you know, and
Mhm.
there's a lot of scenes of them having breakfast. And that's it,
Yeah.
you know, let's see them be like, you've got to remember their people. And that's the
Yeah.
kind of the secret, like, even if you're doing the workplace model of superheroes,
Sure.
like the point of a workplace TV show isn't just the procedural elements, it's the
Right.
bits,
Right.
you know, it's the downtime with the nurses, it's the kind of like that.
Absolutely.
And I think that's the kind of trying to ways to make it I mean, with Eternals at the moment, I'm writing a weird ensemble cast book. And it is
Sure.
like, but for me, like the trying to make the incredible weirdness of their life feel real
Right.
is the point. You
Right.
know,
Right.
and that's a kind of like the mundanity of the impossible. And you know, there's
Yeah.
kind of this
Yeah.
like just try to make people look at stuff in different angles and like empathize with people in different ways. Yeah. I mean, this is kind of what we get to do in terms of we return to problem solving. Okay, what are
Mhm.
we looking for? What are we trying to do here? Because
Yeah.
like when I'm
Yeah.
you know, when I'm doing an action sequence, I'm not what am I really looking for, and that depends on book for book. You know,
Right. One of the things I'm liking about what Zdarsky's been doing over in Daredevil is he's got that,
good, so good.
it's a great book. He's got that policeman who, you know, who hates Daredevil's guts and wants to bring him down or whatever, and then is slowly ratcheting to change his attitude as he realizes where the law can't solve those problems. And I realized as I was reading it, I'm like, there are very few in modern comics. It feels like there's very few normal people, secondary characters anymore. Like,
Yeah,
you know, heroes have to be romancing other heroes, or you know, oh, that person's got a superpower or whatever. And it's like, when was the last time you had, you know, in the classic era of whatever Spider-Man, you've got, you know, Harry Osborn and Mary Jane and all these, that cast of normal people that contrasts off of Peter. And it feels like we've become a little incestuous on heroes, like celebrities mixed with celebrities, and never will they, you know, deign themselves with the plebeians or whatever. Like, and I just liked reading this other character who has a point of view, and it clearly works well with Daredevil, but like that guy's not going to become a superhero. Do you know what I mean? I hope he doesn't. He's not going to get superpowers.
Next issue.
Yeah. Bang. Jim is wrong, but I hope it's not, that's not the journey we're going on, that he can be a cop or he can be a whatever. And that felt like a bit of a harkening back to something that I haven't seen as much of. Do you know what I mean?
No. Well,
Yeah.
I agree. I mean, it's like, especially like when I was doing, obviously Eternals is, I've deliberately set myself an impossible task having 100 lead characters.
Right.
And like for me, it was always no, I need to see them with humans. Like I need to see them go and get coffee. I need, like in the case like you
got to humanize them, otherwise, again, they're just divorced from reality. Yeah.
Exactly that, and that. I mean, for me, the wonder of the Marvel universe is always the idea that I could look to my left and see Spider-Man fly past the window.
Yeah,
you know what I mean. And that's the kind of setting in real cities, and there's something like the transformation in your environment. Mm-hmm. And if I'm not like, I did a story for the Pride anthology about, and it was Speed and Prodigy basically out on a date, and it's just having a pizza slice in the New York, wandering around, and that I need to have my heroes eat pizza slices,
right?
And I interact. That's what I do like a lot. I mean, because if you don't do that, you kind of change genre a bit.
Sure.
But as you become almost a fantasy comic. But it's tricky. You know what I mean? Like, especially like as you say, like,
well, and how much space and where do you put it? Yeah, and how
I think Immortal Hulk. That's an interesting book. I think Immortal. I mean, it's got a lot of superhero stuff, obviously, as well. But Immortal Hulk also has some really interesting human perspectives on the Hulk, and I think that's. I mean, like especially the early issues when it was like without. I mean, I love all of Immortal Hulk.
Sure.
But that kind of how they grounded it and they made it like Al did amazing stuff there.
Yeah, I think it's a constantly being able to evaluate when you have the luxury of knowing you're on a longer term project, and that's one of the difficulties now too. Is it feels like everything is, you've got to have this eject. Hatch ready to go at any moment. You're like, oh, is it going to be 6 issues or 12? We don't know. You're like, okay, I'll make something that works in 6, but I hope I get 12 and maybe I get 24, and you got to kind of constantly be checking yourself against these longer kind of elements or well, we got to see how the sales go. And you totally understand it as a commercial process, but it can be a little bit frustrating on a dramatic level where you're like, I want this to feel like a satisfying meal. I want to be able to deliver on this thing. Or the reverse of like, you keep getting your thing extended and you're like, I thought I only had 4 issues and now you tell me I got 8. You're like, all right, I guess.
And run out the room.
Yeah, better add a side dish to this little thing because it's getting a little crazy. Yeah, totally.
So one of my talking about normalization, one of my this is mainly first time at Marvel. Like I always had a problem of like insufficient aftermath of world shaking events.
Yes.
I want to see and I did a lot of this in Journey into Mystery, like after Fear itself. I had a whole arc about people dealing with trauma and nightmares after them, because it's I mean that stuff really interesting, because it's like
I did a bit with that when I did Uncanny Avengers. We were coming off of Secret Empire and Wanda joins the team and she was just possessed by Chthon and all this stuff. And I was like, that's traumatic stuff. Like, how is she coming into the team? And then I'm doing the research reading. It's like, oh yeah, the last time she saw Rogue, they tried to kill each other when Remender was writing this. And now they're on the team again together. Who's going to extend an olive branch and who's going to slap it away? And how's this going to work? And so you're hearkening to the past and you're also talking about these shared traumas and difficulties and how do we move forward? You know what I mean? I think that those are important things to kind of humanize and anchor these characters in the emotional context. Yeah. Big time. So currently you've got a lot on your docket. You're doing Eternals, obviously. You've got you're wrapping up Die. We didn't even talk about Wicked and the Divine. This is insane. Okay.
I've done it. We've both been around a lot, haven't we? There's a lot of books we've done that by
There's
now.
a lot, right?
It's a bit genuinely disturbing. We've had careers.
So Wicked and Divine is probably your biggest hit, and also kind of your now it's your calling card in all directions, right? So it's you and Jamie building out this epic thing. You knew exactly how long it was going to run, like you'd built the form.
Yes, is the answer.
Yeah, I know you're a formalist in that sense. So
it's one of those like we guessed it about 40 issues.
Right.
Like it wasn't even a guess. It's like we knew the whole story. Like
Mhm.
I had written like significant parts of the final issue at the start.
Oh,
Like
really?
just I didn't know where the final issue was going to be set. It ended up being
Right.
set as a funeral, but I knew certain of the monologues. I knew the final panel,
Nice.
and I knew the shape of it. As in, arc one is this, arc two is this.
Right.
Um, we knew it would be, but we didn't actually say how long it would be. And
Right.
for part of one of the reasons we did that was because I tell you, retailers completely order less if they think the end's coming.
Right.
You know what I mean? There's that kind of like, I'm not telling you how long it's going to be. You'll misorder it. You know. But it was about the end. Like 40-ish, and then it ended up being like 52.
Yeah.
And like in my heart of hearts is this is one of our theories we had is I think most of the classic Vertigo runs are at least 10 issues too long.
Yeah.
I think like, and I say that with somebody who clearly loves them all.
Sure.
But like, I think Preacher could afford losing 10 issues.
Yeah. They don't know
like,
when to, they don't want to say goodbye kind of thing, or
there's a bit of that, but it's also that arc was a bit flabby, and especially because the way you pitch these books are kind of like you pitch the early stuff's pretty well thought out.
Sure.
But then it kind of then the stuff further out may be a bit looser, and then you realize, oh no, I've written this down as an arc, but it's actually not an arc.
Right.
So I figured 50 issues would make it hit harder. And to be honest, I'm not sure I was right. I think actually some of Wycliffe is hurt by being compressed as it is. Yeah. But yeah, we sort of knew those, the 1, 2, 3, 4 of it, as in, okay, year 1 is this, year 2 is that, year 3 is that, and year 4 is this. So all those kind of things were there. I mean, I knew like the characters, I knew their I use the word hamartia because I just like saying, I've read some Aristotle. No, that kind of, the subtext of that statement. But but it was like, this character, what's their point, what they're about, what's their fatal flaw, and all that kind of stuff is there. But I also, by at least part of it, was all those sort of Vertigo books we've loved. And I'll come back in a second and say why I'm talking about Vertigo books. Is they were broad enough to be a device to be able to build in the whatever the creator got interested in across the 5 years it took to do. Because one of the thing of those books is they're 5 years long. You're going to change in that period. You're going to grow and, hopefully grow anyway. And you're going to discover stuff. And what is sort of, in the case of Wycliffe, it's across 6,000 years of human history. We've got these things, we can talk about art across this whole period. So that was always built into it. So that kind of, you can plan to be flexible. And weirdly, that's what Marvel has taught me. Like you're saying earlier about the 6 versus 12 issue thing. Like I did a book called That Journey into Mystery, the Loki book. And at the start, I knew the whole plot for that. But it was flexible enough to basically, it was designed as a device to subvert whatever tie-ins I had to go into. It was like literally like, I'm going to take, it's like that little maggot thing that crawls in people's ears in Star Trek. Like I'm going to take over anything I even touch. And it was sometimes like, and it was, and the whole end is based around Loki is trapped because there's a problem and there's 2 problems happen at once.
Right.
And he can't deal with them both. And I sort of knew, I set up both of those problems and I didn't really know which one would be the one which we dealt with in the final arc and the one he missed.
Right.
But they could have, we could have flipped them. So that kind of planning and all that kind of stuff I learned at Marvel through desperation and trying to deal with weird situations is stuff I apply to the ongoing to try to work,
and you no longer have the fear of it's going to be pulled out from under you. But now you have you do. Sure. Of course, if the sales are apocalyptic and what may have you, but you still have this greater sense of, I have more control of my hand on the steering wheel, but now I can I'm obsessed with a new thing, or I'm fascinated by these elements. Now we're going to turn it into this, or, I thought we were going here, but a better idea struck me while we were on the path. Yeah.
It's definitely, especially like on the 4th year, I still paraphrase it, solve the equation. Like I knew what the story is about, but also I knew that so much of the stuff would be in the air by then, and I would want to put it together.
Sure.
And I would take the pieces we've created, and and it just, that's exactly how Wycliffe has worked, and that kind of.
Those are those great moments. I love when I'm writing a story, and even though I know the ending, there are certain moments along the way I didn't know how I was going to get there or exactly how they were going to pay off. And then you start, like, you've thrown all these kind of strings out into the ether. And then you're sort of like, oh, of course those two tie together. And of course that all is going to lead us to this. And people look later and they go, oh, you planned that all out? And you want to say yes, but you're like, sort of, like, I knew I was going to tie it off, but I didn't know it was going to happen there and then, and it was going to feel so satisfying. I did plan it, but I left myself enough, kind of improv room, I guess. Yeah.
Because it's like, if you overplan it, essentially, you're typing for like 5 years.
Sure.
But also, like, there's so much more. Like, you get to be you need to be more elegant if you actually leave that wiggle.
Yes.
I mean, some of the stuff is like in the like, spoilers for Wicked, everyone. But near the end, like when they're rescuing, I didn't realize Lucifer would be the final villain.
Right.
As in, the final thing to overcome. And in retrospect, and that came from me realizing Anang's position was untenable. Like, oh no, she's lost already. There's not much drama here. And then it's like, oh no, but this works. Of course, Lucifer's going to be it. And she's the person who Laura was first, brought into this world with. And this is the person they have to overcome. Mm-hmm. And my synopsis was kind of like, and Laura talks Lucifer into it. And I didn't really know exactly how. And part of me was aware that maybe she wouldn't, and I'll have to just kill Lucifer. Right. I'm writing to save Lucifer, essentially. But then I get to all the way through Wicked, we've had this repeating image of us characters transform, falling down this well of faces, which is like one of Wicked's iconic images, and it goes all the way through. We hit it like 5 times or something like that. And it was only literally in that sequence I realized we just reverse it, and we have like Laura dragging Lucifer up from the bottom. Nice. And so we just and it looks like, obviously people can fall, people can climb. It's
obviously been the plan. Yeah. And how could it not be? And then you sort of look and you go, yeah, we didn't figure that out until that moment.
That's it. I wrote that and I was like, I know my muse will work. Oh, shit. You know what I mean? I don't normally say muse. I know.
I get it. Yeah. You don't have to be disgusted by your own whatever. It sounds lovey-dovey or hippy-dippy or whatever you want to call it. This idea of, oh yeah, I'll jump and then something will catch me on the way. But once you've done this enough, I was trying to explain to someone. They said, do you have writer's block, or do you have imposter syndrome, or all those things? You've written a whole bunch of stuff, shelves of books and whatever. It's like, yes, I still have those things. And well, how do you break through them? I said, well, the difference is I still feel that stuff, but I've done it enough that instead of being like, I suck, I'm terrible, I'll never finish this, I go, oh, this is the part where I think I suck, where I think I can't finish it. Man, I wish I didn't have that, but here I am again. And I know, because I have proof, I've done it so many times, I've come through whatever you want to call it, dark night of the soul, blah, blah, blah. I come out the other side, right? And so the same kind of thing with the writing, where it sounds really corny to someone on the outside to go, oh, I jump and then I know someone's going to catch me, or the narration's going to catch me, the characters. And you go, no, when you've done this stuff enough, you can set up problems, and the unconscious mind and all the tools that you've built up in your repertoire, something will poke its way out.
Yeah.
But it sounds very froofy, like, oh yeah, sure, it's the art and it'll just strike me. And you're like, it's not quite that, but there is an element of it,
Yeah. I mean, it's called creativity for a reason, I guess.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, it is that, and it's kind of that moment of delight.
Yes, it is a delight. It is a delight. And it's hard to explain to people. Like 3 or 4 weeks ago, I was trying to break a pitch. I was trying to figure out this concept, and I know why I like it, but I couldn't explain the conflict. And it was just like, oh, I don't know. And I'm in that weird space where I'm waking up, but I'm not fully awake. And I'm just sort of lying in bed and thinking about random things and what I got to do today. And then that pitch comes across my brain again. And all of a sudden it was just like, oh, it's got to be this. Like, it is this poignant thing about us. And I just went, oh God. And I kind of like pushed myself out of bed because I got to type this out. And Stacy's like, are you okay? Because I had this frantic kind of thing. I'm like, give me like 2 minutes. And I just pounded out a bunch of these statements. And then I was like, okay, let's have some coffee and get the day going. And she's like, is everything okay? And I go, actually, I'm great now. I'm in this great space because I just kind of grabbed this thing out of the ether and wrestled it to the ground. And now I'm so excited for the rest of my day. And there's a delight in that. There's an absolute delight. Yeah.
I know. It's the addictive. I mean, like, it's just so addictive in that way. It's like, me and Stephanie talking about what we're doing next. And I've sort of said, oh, I'll write something for you. She wants to work with me again. So we're going to do something else. And I had that kind of like, most of this year, I've been like, no, I don't know what I'm going to do.
Right.
But I just know something about just the fact it's a problem. I will share it over, and
something's going to start.
Hole, and something will turn up. And I must admit, I was starting to have doubts, but like, but there was that kind of like, this is just you start thinking, and like it's that kind of like which your brain just start digging away. So that's fun, that's
Yeah,
the
yeah, and asking little internal questions, you know what I
yeah.
mean? Or you're looking at some piece of news or some piece of pop culture or something, and you're sort of like, oh, there's another angle on that, or though there's an interesting, kind of parallel to other thoughts or other emotions or other feelings. And sometimes they're not directly to that thing. Like, it's not like looking at the news and go, I'm going to take that piece of news and put it in my story. It's just, oh, this makes me feel this way. Why is that? Or what am, and exploring some of those things and kind of chipping away at it and trying to find an angle. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh no,
Totally.
that's really. I mean, that conscious, like, why do I? There's a really great bit in one of the Alan Moore on writing comics essays, just about they're kind of like just digging into why do I find like the images of children dying in Ethiopia upsetting, and that kind of like and that those kind of like really talk to you, like what is bothering me here? What's really? But I think I found myself often thinking about the flip, and you may get this from work for hire. I don't know. This might just be me, but like my subconscious is utterly shameless in my work for hire. Like, especially, but you're writing so quickly. Like, it's like it just comes out in streams. Like, I always think about like that 4 arc, that randomly extending 4 arc I mentioned.
Right.
Like, and that is, there's a lot about signing contracts that may take your soul, that you may lose control of yourself. There's magical rings that control people. There's all this kind of stuff. These are the devices. I'm getting married then. I'm signing my Marvel exclusive. Like, you know what I mean? Like, this is not even subtle.
So it's somewhere between symbolism and therapy. Is that what you're saying?
Oh yeah, my stuff is so like. I mean, my stuff is always therapy, I guess. And like, I'm quite. That's not quite true, because you pay for therapy, you get paid for writing, so it's very different. But there's definitely kind of like my wrestling with my demon. I mean, God, every cliche is coming at me, Jim. I swear I'm not this bad. Like, I'm emotionally committed to my nonsense. That's I will say, like, I've got many faults as a writer, and it's always weird that people think I'm cold as a writer, because it's like, and I can understand why, because there's so much like aggressive. I mean, the formalism for a start, and the fact how locked up a lot of the characters are. You know what I mean? Like, I write people who are oppressed. And like, so I always like Cyclops. That kind of like, he's not going to express anything. But that kind of like, it's always wrestling with life and death, and like, what on earth is anything for, and why the hell are we doing this anyway? Yeah.
So are people surprised then when you're much more jovial and kind of?
I don't know. What do you reckon? I mean, what did you think about me before I met? That's a question.
I mean, I don't know. I think I've got, if I'm being 100% honest, I think I have in my head that this block of brilliant British writers, because they overtook comics in the mid 80s and just kind of dropped brilliance, and not only dropped brilliance on their own creations, a la Sandman and everything else, but also were able to like tinker with the American dream and all these other big ideas about, kind of core superhero things, and do it so brilliantly. So there's like an intimidation factor of, oh geez, this brilliant British coming in and just gonna tear everything apart. And it's so there's always this like weird intimidating factor, you know what I mean? I think Zdarsky and I joke around occasionally that it's like, oh, the polite Canadians, we have to surprise you, because people assume we're just kind of go along to get along and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I definitely thought that you were, thinking on these deeper levels about storytelling and the formalists, because there is a structural quality to a lot of the stuff you're doing. And, as much as that might be, some of it is coming up within the moment, your brain is certainly solving those kinds of formalist problems on some way, or you're setting yourself up with foundations that stack well, if that makes sense. Do you know what I mean? And are easy to refer back to. And so in that way, I think, I sort of looked at your stuff, and when I was reading it, I was like, it's this fascinating element, because there's the club culture stuff like, Phonogram, which was about kind of a moment in time or a feeling of that scene, right? And then there were these bigger ideas, philosophical ideas about magic and bonds and like you were saying, contracts and things like that in Thor. And it's like, oh, this guy's doing all this stuff, like he's thinking about it and kind of pouring himself into it in all these kind of funky ways. But I think because I'd read Phonogram, I was like, oh no, this is a club kid with big thoughts, right? Like that very much came through kind of pure. Whereas I think if people came to your stuff first with superheroes, they would be like, oh, he is a philosopher. Do you know what I mean?
Interesting. So
Yeah.
I think about the alternate dimension where I came in with die rather than phonogram first. You know what I mean? Like,
well, then you'd just be one of the tabletop nerds with
exactly,
me, right?
like,
So
some hyper pretentious tabletop nerds. You know what I mean?
right.
So like and these are both true things about me. This is
So in terms of tabletop, die really surprised me when I was reading it. First of all, as everyone knows, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool, tabletop. I know I've written more RPG comics than I think anybody else. It's kind of ridiculous. And so, you look at it and then you're like, curses, that's a really brilliant idea. That's really sharp and fun. And then the ways you were able to push out, and it's not just kind of navel gazing gaming, it's pushing in all these different areas in terms of talking about war and growing up and regret and all these other kinds of things. So for yourself, when did you get into gaming, and how did that become die in a sense?
That's interesting. Right, it's like I found myself thinking, like, I like music in the same way I like role-playing games as a vehicle for fantasy.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, and for me, that they were, especially growing in a small town like Stafford, as I mentioned, they were always kind of close together for me, and I didn't really ever see the contrast as much, which might have been my weird whatever damage I have. But for me, like, I see Die and Phonogram as weirdly kind of sister books in that they're both about, here's an obsession, and here's why this is about why I think we're obsessed and how this harms us and how this makes us better. You know what I mean? Both are kind of asking, except like one is something people think is cool, quote in quotation marks, and the other one is about something that people think is nerdy in bedrooms. And
although what's insane now is how people think it's cool now, like trying to explain to people about the Satanic Panic and the 80s and the how Dungeons and Dragons was framed in that time period. And now you've got librarians begging kids to come in and play D&D, and the creativity. It's like, oh, at least they're not on their screens. Like that seems to be the contrast point. Oh, they're spending time together and they're socializing. Well, it's better than video games or whatever the current, fear mongering is and what may have you. Sorry, you were saying about
I've even seen some people sort of trying to downplay the Satanic Panic era. Yeah. And it's like, you have no idea. You really have no idea.
No.
I got into game. I think games, because I used to view video games and RPGs and stuff as different things, and I don't now. I just think there's games. I think that's a medium.
They're vehicles for
they're all the same. So all my whole life, like since like 4 or so, I've been into gaming in some way or another.
Sure.
And I got into RPGs first. I mean, obviously the Fighting Fantasy books in the UK, so that stuff I don't think counts, but still kind of counts.
Yeah.
So I'm always being RPG curious. I
like the Fighting Fantasy books because they I feel like they're a really good vehicle, because those choose your own adventure style books are the branching narrative paths give you choices, but it's not just throwing into the deep end and saying you have all the choices. You're like, well, I don't know what I feel. I don't feel confident to make those. So it says, here's 3 options or 2 options or whatever of these 2, which is more the way you're leaning. Yeah.
I mean, also stuff like the Fighting Fantasy in the UK. The art's horrific and fascinating.
Yeah.
But also like there's some 2000 AD to them, and they're quite disreputable. Like the American, the choose your own adventure books are all quite wholesome adventures.
Sure.
These are much more like, this dude's just sawed off your head. And here's
they're amazing. There's certain images from Ian McKeag drew the Death Trap Dungeon. And I got to meet him, and it was so funny because we were talking about, everyone was asking about his concept work for Star Wars or Marvel or all the things he'd done, this movie stuff. And we were finishing up the talk, and I was like, Death Trap Dungeon. And he just started laughing. He was like, oh, I know you. Like, I know exactly the kind of person you are, that's the first thing you thought of in that way. Yeah.
Honestly, I'm excited. That Death Trap Dungeon, some of the images in that are like
incredible.
It's like just wonderful. Anyway, but
my first arc of Conan is basically like a bow to Death Trap Dungeon. It's Conan being pulled into this dungeon beneath a city. It's a contest for this death god that they have to sacrifice to the death god every year. Like it's Death Trap Dungeon with the serial numbers filed off and with a bit of a different philosophical slant. Absolutely.
It's like honestly, it's the Enter the Dragon. I mean, there's something really Death Trap Dungeon is like, okay, people not listening who don't know the idea. But there's a dungeon full of death and traps.
Yeah. What could it be? Yeah.
And it's just a competition, and it starts with all these cool heroes, and they all go in. So in the game, they have the draw in the lot, so you know people are ahead in the dungeon ahead of you.
Yeah.
And you find some of them, you find your corpses. So it's a bit like Cube and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
You know,
it's the original. It's like, you know, the whatchamacallit, all the any of those kinds of death contests or battle royale.
Yeah, exactly. Battle royale
stuff. Exactly. Yeah.
Like, and it's like there's such a something really. I'll be thinking about Death Trap Dungeon myself in that kind of ways, and there's something really nice in there. And actually, when we start recording, I'll tell you about my next book I want to do.
Oh, okay.
Which has some of that energy.
Nice.
But also, actual RPGs.
Right.
Like, you know, starting around, I got into Tolkien. So I got my first RPG system given to me. I was 10. I got given the Middle Earth role playing system.
Ah, interesting.
First.
So even before D&D.
Yeah, before D&D. And of course, Have you ever played MERPS?
I have not.
It is not for a 10-year-old. There is.
I like how you are. I thought you were going to say something really complimentary, and then you sort of swerve it. It is not for a 10-year-old.
When I've been designing the Die RPG at the moment, when I started, I was aware that there's still bits of MERP design still in my head. I was aware I'd recreated one of its overcomplicated role systems in my first draft. And it's like, no, get rid of that. That was crap. MERPS was a cut-down Rollmaster. And Rollmaster, of course, is what people might know. It's the one which had the arms law, which is every single weapon had its own D100 table with like 20 columns, which also looks up criticals.
Yeah.
So MERPS wasn't that, but it had a lot of tables. So this 10-year-old just gets it open. Me and my brother, who's like 2.5 years younger, looking at it, like, and we cut out little figures and pushed them around the maps and rolled stuff on the tables. And across the next few years, I just learned a bit more each time. So we played, like, it was a game we had, and we ran it a couple of times, not knowing how it really worked.
Yeah, that's very much my older brother and I. We actually got the basic D&D box set, but then we got the advanced Dungeons and Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide, and we didn't understand because they use all the same terminology. How could they not be compatible? And so my brother was just muddling his way through it, and I was like, I'm having a good time, so whatever, it's good enough, you know.
If it works, it works. I said I had the advanced D&D manual. And I never had any of the other manuals. And it was one of those like, and it was more like an object type. Like, it was just fascinating as a thing, because like there's a real magical I mean, it's probably part of where Die comes from, but yeah, the weirdness of old RPG stuff, because those dice, if you look at this D20 I've been playing with, the D20 is a weird object.
It is.
And like, no wonder the parents were scared. Like, literally, it looks like they've got.
And also, I think the obtuse nature of it, there was a certain element of it there that someone can't just instantly show you how to play, or they can show you how to play, but if you look at it from the outside, it's this strange artifact, and you're flipping through the book and you're like, there's all these numbers and tables and cross references and terminology. What is this thing? And then someone goes, oh, I will show you, my friend. Oh, I will bring you, we will cross the Rubicon and you will understand. Yeah.
Honestly, you're absolutely right. And it's that kind of obviously Magic Circle is a part of the theory people talk about of RPGs. There's a lot of stuff there, and anyway, all that's that's just interesting, and it's an interesting form because it's basically it's this weird sort of magical negotiation, I guess.
Well, that's what's amazing about it is what other kind of medium are you spending time with other people and collaboratively doing something in real time like that? You know what I mean? There's not much else like it. Like, playing a sport or whatever, there's certain set rules and you can decide if you want to throw stuff out or house rule it, playing whatever, baseball in the park. But this is so different because you're narratively engaging it, or you're painting the scene and then building it out. And that's what I find so fascinating about it, is people's fear of it, like, oh, I'm going to do it wrong, I'm going to break it, it's going to suck, or I don't do those things. And you're like, do what? Like, have fun, engage with each other, come up with a fun story. I feel like it should be, for everyone, and yet people feel like they have these real distinct barriers to getting into it.
I end up like, I was saying, I was in Ireland with a bunch of Irish creators, and one of them asked me, I was leaving the pub. I said, Kevin, you play RPGs, don't you? And I was like, yes. I've been known to dabble. He was like, what? Can you explain them to me? And I had my taxi was arriving in 5-10 minutes. So I said, okay, let's do it right now. And it was like, off some head, improvise the game. So everyone get a number of coins out of your pocket, put them on the table. I'm going to tell you stuff. You tell me what you do. Anytime you want to change the narrative in any significant way, push one of your coins across the table. So your coin just became like whatever action it is.
Yeah.
And I was just like, okay, you're in a pub, you're sitting in this fancy world, etc., etc. Oh, and there's a dragon just right outside, it's attacking the place. Like, what are you doing? And they kind of do some bits and stuff. And then I think it's Deborah Kelly. She picked up her coin and said, I'm going to fly out the window and kill the dragon. And I just say, great, do that. Tell me what it looks like. And then the rest of the table gets it in that kind of, oh, wait. That was the rule. This is now, and no matter what rules you plug into, this is where all RPGs changes, what rules you plug into, how the rules, when the rules get to kick the narrative. And like some games take one route, some takes the other. But the one I just did was whatever coins. And then something, it's just really, the core of it is really quite simple. And that's common across most RPGs.
Mm-hmm.
The other flip you made me think about, in Die, we're doing interviews with a load of developers and RPG designers in the back and VMs and whatever. And the first one I did with Alex Roberts. Alex Roberts is the amazing designer of a game called For the Queen, which I really like. And she also did a podcast series, which is basically interviewing a load of developers across this period. But my argument is basically this has been the noughties were the most important time for RPG development since the first decade. Mm-hmm. That's kind of my theory, for a bunch of reasons. And I picked, the last person interviewed was Matt Mercer to sort of talk about the the streaming and popularization. But she, so I pause. Alex is she. I have to check the pronouns. At the end of the interview, there's a sort of quote, and she's talking about people talk about the idea of creators being this magical other thing. And her take, a game sort of proves that's not true. A game is about the proof that we can make entire stories, entire worlds. We're sitting around a table with some friends. And I think the creativity is infinite is the thing that games explain to people.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that I really enjoy, when you bring someone into the forum and they suddenly realize that their choices matter and that they are, in that moment, important, and they get to decide how things are going to go, something unlocks inside them, something very visceral, because in their day-to-day lives, they don't get those kinds of decisions, or they don't get asked what they want. I mean, how many times do you go through the day and you're moving through systems that already exist, trying to find your way within them, and then we say, yes, there's a system here, but it's actually built to make you awesome and to make this fun. And what do you want to do? And I want you to do it. And you're just like, what? And the minute that unlocks in someone, I feel like it's a real, there's something magical about being there in that moment and then them realizing it. Yeah.
Also being listened to. I mean, also like we took this, we both almost certainly read so many GM advice stuff over the years, but like one of those absolute, we talk about one of the most core skills is just listening. Yep. Like that's an improv skill, and being listened to is like absolutely so deep in so many RPGs. It's potent. My actions have power, and they have power because the person has listened to you and integrated the ideas.
One of my favorite things, I remember I was running a tournament module, and to give people context, tournament modules are this really weird form where this was at the University of Waterloo here in Ontario, and over a weekend, everyone is playing the same adventure and the same pre-built characters. And depending on what you do, of course, it's going to go in wildly different directions. And some of the groups get very narrative and some of them get very strategic, how far along you get in the adventure, how well you play. People get scored, and then there were prizes and all this stuff. And hearing from the dungeon masters all the ridiculous ways the exact same ingredients came together to make insanely different outcomes was a lot of fun. But that adventure, there was this little bit of background material, and you give someone a pre-made character and you hope that they read it and that they internalize it because they didn't get to make it. And all of a sudden I'm like, there's one person in this group, he's with a group of friends, he's clearly not, like, he's been dragged along with the others, and you're like, oh God, this dude's not going to enjoy this at all. And we're leading up to this big narrative moment that's all about his character's backstory. And I'm like, oh no, this is just going to fall so flat. And then all of a sudden I put out this little clue, and the dude just brightens up and he screams out the name of this villain because he knows who it is because it's on the character sheet. And all of a sudden he's totally invested, and the whole table's just roaring. And you're like, oh, this is magic. This is awesome. This is such a cool engagement. And that, again, that idea of, giving people the tools to express themselves and stuff. It's awesome. It's so much fun. Yeah, it's amazing. So how does that turn into Die, the comic story?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically kind of like RPGs were one of my major like obsessive things across my teenage years, and I drifted out the form like pretty much when I went to close to when I was going to university. I was into
Okay.
music and video games a bit. I was segueing into video games a bit more.
So what games were you playing? Middle Earth, but what did you, when
Oh,
you were really obsessed, was it like the White Wolf stuff, or was it?
no, actually, weirdly I always avoided White Wolf. And also, I'm
Really?
slightly, I'm like, um, I've also been slightly late actually because I was playing. No, I could have been in Vampire actually. Vampire was
Yeah.
abstractly possible. But I read like RPG magazines, so I was quite up to date with what was coming out.
Sure.
I was very into Cyberpunk. I got
Yeah.
like first edition Cyberpunk. I was in that early. I got
Mhm.
Cyberpunk zines. I was GURPS. I played a lot of GURPS. I was
Yeah.
very into just my hacking together systems was always my kind of. I played GURPS, but eventually because I really liked the manuals, but I eventually realized I was stripping out a lot of the rules. It was
Right.
one of those bits that like there was stuff I liked there. Paranoia I loved. We did
Oh,
play
yeah.
D&D, but like D&D was never really our real game.
Right.
But like, we played D&D a bit, like Redbox going through. But Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, that was the big teenage campaign.
Yeah.
Like, which perhaps unsurprisingly being a Brit and also being me, like we played all the way through the enemy with, all the way through the enemy within campaign, which is like the classic Warhammer campaign, which is like my
Nice.
major sort of teenage thing. So that was kind of like the there's probably a few more things in the mix there.
Sure.
Like,
So how does that inform then the comic story? Because the comic story is a riff on the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon idea of these kids being taken away off to this fantasy world.
yeah, I mean, it involves like basically the idea. I mean, this is like 2017 or whatever. I think it's 2017 at San Diego. I'm hanging around with Ray Fawkes and Jamie McKelvey. And we're just, shooting crap and making jokes. And we just started making jokes about D&D cartoon kids. I said, whatever happened to them? And we talked about, the whole story about how it got made and, the last episode never got produced. But
Yeah.
there's a YouTube version now. And it's like, we sort of joking, them being middle-aged, whatever. And that sort of stuck with me. And it kind of the idea then like a bunch of middle-aged people dealing with their teenage fantasy world was suddenly appealing, especially because I wanted to, especially after WicDiv. My main thing after WicDiv is I didn't want to write teenagers again.
Yeah.
I mean, because I've never really viewed myself as someone particularly obsessed with that period. And it's just that by the
even though two of your seminal pieces are kind of built off of that.
Yeah. And also it's like Phonogram is mainly about 20 somethings. That's the weird thing about it. And but like people count pop music as young.
Sure.
But I was never writing about only like there were a bunch of 19-year-olds in singles club and 9 going on 20. It was about turning 20. In some ways, Phonogram is about being 20 to 30 because 30 is basically when Cole gets kicked out.
Right.
And then Young Avengers, we were asked to do. We had to be taught to doing Young Avengers. Always remember.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I mean, not in a bad way, just because it's a classic book. It's a classic Marvel superhero style story, and I really like it. But it's not what me and Jamie do.
Right.
And we were expressing they wanted a hostile takeover. That was the way Axel phrased it. That's across the whole Marvel now. Like really make it your own. And the idea of let's do it like we own it. And I was asked to do Generation Hope, like a Teenage Mutant book as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so coming up off the back of Young Avengers just seemed logical to. We'd be a fool not to do a book that was at least aesthetically connected to Young Avengers in some way because we want to like do a 50-issue series. We can be slightly cynical here. So like, I mean, obviously that's on us. But like, after all of that, it was like, no, I can't write teenagers again for a while. Otherwise, I won't be able to like bear
escape.
myself.
Yeah.
Exactly. These people have to be at least as old as I am. So I was looking, we said earlier about looking for ideas. I was looking for an idea about people who were at least 40 something. And the idea of like, okay, what's going on with my life? How do I compare where I am now to where I was there? And then, it suddenly appeared a really dramatic device and it sort of came from there. And I thought back, and of course, that time, you're mining personal feelings for a lot of stuff, especially my more serious career around. I was, this links back to me looking at that kind of RPG group then, not that anyone in Dive was actually one for one of any of my friends, and then and I mean that in a very real way, as in these group is hugely different from that area, but that kind of what we were like as of slightly elitist RPG geeks in 1991. You know what I mean? So I'm writing authentically about RPG geeks from Stafford in 1991. And that kind of, there's a bit early on when they looked down at D&D. That was completely our group. We were like, that the way that, because that's something you don't see in pop culture. We talk about music fans being obnoxious because they are often. We don't talk about the idea that, gatekeeping is a little bit, it's not like it's gatekeeping. It's specifically if you play this.
It's internal filtering. Like our group doesn't. Yeah.
So like I wanted to write people who are as snobby as phonogram characters, but as snobby and flawed and human and messy,
Sure.
but like from RPG culture, because they were. So that kind of it's material I sort of dug into.
Nice.
But then it's all just with most of my stuff, there's so much research. So it's like the personal stuff. So I researched the entire of. So instead of being like a sensible, like this is a story about human emotions, just because you could have completely done that story, and you probably should have. I ended up like, okay, let's talk about the entire history of RPGs. How did RPGs get to be?
Right.
What is fantasy for? Because that's kind of like when I started asking like what comparing their fantasies to their reality is, it becomes much more about the question of why fantasy anyway.
Right.
And then especially with the world right now, a lot of thinking about like how much are we a world that's being consumed by fantasy? The word consumed is always like that haunts die. Consumer implies that as well.
Well, and the need / obsession with escapism in the face of things that we can't change or fix, or the world as a series of cycles that we are trapped in, rather than being able to do something about. Yeah.
I mean, delusion is fantasy. I mean, you could argue delusion is fantasy gone sour.
Yeah.
That kind of like, and like all that stuff sort of built into die really, and like, but it's also much like he's also one of the RPGs are important because I think RPGs are culturally important.
Yeah.
In a weird, like, look how much language like Level Up has entered society, and of course people say, that's from MMOs or whatever. But where do you think MMOs got it from?
Yeah, exactly. No, I mean, so many of the systems of video games are built off of the board game or miniature gaming models, just with digital platforms for delivery, right?
Yeah.
I remember as a kid thinking about how cool it would be to think of those miniature games like your Warhammer, stuff like that, like coming to life across the table. And now in games, we see that all the time, Like,
yes, I mean, the idea. That's the thing about like actually RPGs and also the miniature games. The idea, like, you can animate it, but it's sort of the idea exists before the existence precedes. My existentialism is gone. But you know what I mean? Yeah, all that stuff.
Yeah. It's exciting stuff. It's fun, man. I love seeing your work develop. I love seeing you constantly digging into these, different subjects and finding new angles and things to build on. So, Eternals has been a unique challenge for you because you're taking an established mythology and you're putting your own stamp on it. How far out have you been able to kind of build that myth or those story plans? Are you thinking years ahead, or are you thinking in the more immediate?
It's complicated.
Sure.
What I did with Eternals is I've got a list of aims very long.
Of course.
One of the core sentences I use, and I've sort of got into a weird Tolkien. I mean, Die has basically made me re-examine Tolkien. And it made me, because like Tolkien is obviously literally one of my founding influences, but also a founding influence I kind of got a bit Oedipal with, in terms of like I got quite angry with Tolkien in terms of like Tolkien's influence and implicit ideas in Tolkien. And through doing Die, I've ended up forgiving him a lot because I've ended up seeing Tolkien as a human being, the same way you see you're angry with your father, then you start understanding your father as a human being who is flawed.
Right.
That kind of like that stuff. But also, it's weirdly, I think I view Tolkien weirdly as one of the world's most successful outsider artists.
Yeah.
like he's not connected to any other fantasy. I mean, obviously he is the Inkling, but
Sure,
the idea of what a nerd fantasy writer is, that's not Tolkien. Tolkien would not have gone to the Yukos. But the idea, the weird weight of Middle Earth and the emotional buy-in. So with the Eternals, I had the idea of trying to turn continuity into mythology. In that I was kind of taking all the stuff that all these writers across the years have done and said, okay, let's pretend it was all meant to be one piece of paper to begin with. And
right.
We've got enough chance to step back and try to weave it into this large history. So I've got like, the Tolkien, you've got those walls that happen in the appendixes and the Silmarillion. We've got all that. So I've looked at the major events in the modern history, which have been even like there's stuff which we've only really ever seen for a couple of panels, which is enormously important for the Eternals. And I was like, no, that's as important as the War with the Rings, the Eternals, and all that, and all this kind of society. So I've got all this material. And the joy is, even if we overdid, let's say we overdid 12 issues or whatever, this weight of the material gives the material we do release a sense of solidity above and beyond.
It recontextualizes it. Yeah.
It's sort of the idea, the idea that if you look left and right in this narrative, there's more shit there.
Right.
And this will go on and on and on. So in other words, that's what with just the sheer size of it is the important thing. And then it becomes like, as long as we carry on doing it, literally I have an infinite amount of stuff to write.
Cool.
I'm never going to be able to write, and just I wouldn't want to, because it's like in the same way Tolkien doesn't want to turn us, you don't want to have a story about okay,
yeah, you don't want to close off every
Silmarillion.
avenue. Yeah.
And I've no desire to write Silmarillion.
Right.
So that basically I view I have enough material to carry on writing Eternals for years if I wanted to.
Cool.
I also think, but I didn't plan that.
Right.
Is that way of putting it? I'm planning for and I also this all stuff is set up and available, and I've got documents and Bibles, and it's like this is all really solid stuff to actually ground if anyone else was going to take on after me as well. So I view myself as basically, let's make the Eternals really solid and useful as part of the Marvel universe. Because the other thing is trying to give them a niche, trying to give them a use to any other writer who might, why would I want to bring the Eternals in?
Right. I think that's been one of the fears of the past is where do they fit? Because they don't feel like they have a simple, what the X-Men represent or how the Fantastic Four, this is a Fantastic Four kind of threat. They should show up here and do a thing, or this is a Spider-Man style kind of adventure, or wouldn't it be neat if we crossed your Doctor Strange and your Spider-Man or your whatever? And the Eternals have always kind of felt like, yeah, what are those guys doing? Like, why them? Yeah.
What's their job? I mean, their job is the way of putting it. You know what I mean?
Right,
it's like giving them a job. What would really, they're kind of like monsters, because it's like they're of course the big problem is the fact they weren't originally part of the Marvel universe,
sure,
and they were retconned in. So that so in other words, they've got a really useful purpose in a universe where there's no gods.
Right.
That's the point of them. They're and we've had to sort of cheat all along. And when let's make them angels was my thought, or the equivalent of angels, because if you look at the metaphor anyway, they're created by the Celestials, who are actually the gods in this metaphor.
Right.
They're fighting these things called deviants, who are clearly look like demons. That's the point of them. So what are they? Oh, they're angels. They're eternal and changing beings. Then of course you get the idea of guardian angels and all that kind of. So they're kind of their job is kind of protecting the earth, which is obviously everyone's job, but specifically protecting the earth from monsters. So they're kind of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. They are they've been around
on this
forever.
Cosmic scale.
Yeah. So anytime a monster, a certain kind of monster on Earth, that's their job. They're kind of like, I mean, police would be a good way of describing it as well. And I mean that in the modern, you have questions about them as well. Why?
Sure.
The Eternals aren't good guys.
Yeah, right. And they have moral failings and all those kinds of
Yeah. Absolutely. Some of the Eternals are absolutely good, good characters. And what story evolves basically at the moment, half the Eternals have our lead Eternals have kind of left the Eternals now because frankly they've discovered something awful about them.
Right.
To that. So give them a job and give them a tragedy and make the Marvel characters really.
Nice. Yeah. Awesome. Kieran, I love it. I love talking about this stuff. I love digging below the surface on it. Thank you for spending the time and digging in. It is great to see you just in general. I know it's so weird. I'm glad I've been able to set up these calls with people because I get to see friends and get to touch base. And then you and I have never spent an hour or so just talking about, you or your work or the philosophies behind it. And I think that there's something really, it's nice to be able to do so. It's a joy. So
I remember the first time we hung out alone together, I think. I mean, we both hung out a bunch of times, but after I ran that die game for you, we had an hour of just talking some crap. And, it got to, and I got to know you.
Yeah. That was a wonderful night. To give people some context, it was San Diego Comic-Con 2 years ago. Yeah. And you were running a play test of the game. I got invited along. We ran the game. It was a blast. It was such a weird and wild kind of scenario. It was really, really good. And then we had time to grab a drink and hang out. And it's so rare to have that kind of decompression time off a convention because so many people are running to the airport or heading out or have meetings they've got to wrap up or things like that. But I was heading to LA to do a bunch of business. So I was sticking around, and you, I think, just had a longer itinerary or whatever. And we were able to make it work.
I can't remember why.
Yeah, but it was great. It was just a really nice time to sort of go, oh, look, touching base on a human being level, because so much of the convention is sort of these flyby, oh, good to see you, awesome, how's your wife or whatever. And now it's like, it just humanizes all of it a bit more, and there's a joy to that. And we haven't been able to do that, so many of us, in so long. So awesome. I'm really glad we were able to chat, and I am pumped to see what you've got coming down the pipe. Die's all done. Eternals is
So
hopefully eternal.
Stephanie's finishing up the last couple of pages right now. It's
Yeah,
like,
nice.
come on, Stephanie, we can do it.
Yeah. So it's just, when does the last issue come out?
September the 28th, I think.
Amazing.
So tight. It's close.
Yeah,
now.
you're right down to the wire now on it.
Yeah.
And then what else? You've got Ludocrats.
Look, Ludicrous came out. It's in a trade now.
Okay.
Quantum Futures coming back out. Me, Dan Moore, Tamara.
Yeah.
Eternals. That's all at the moment.
Hey, that's not bad.
There's something unannounced.
Yeah.
Like, which is fun. And there is, I mentioned I might be doing something with Stephanie afterwards.
Yeah.
The other thing is the RPG will be kickstarted at some point soon.
Amazing.
Like, so that's exciting and petrifying. And there's a couple of things in other media. That's sort of thing you always say in it.
Of course. Yeah, it's nice. It's nice when you've got some traction in those areas, but you learn not to lean on it. You're just like, okay, if it happens, great. Oh, that seems positive, cool. And then you just keep doing your thing, which is nice too.
It's very important not to care. That's the kind of like, if you stop. I always remember, like, have you read Fortune and Glory, the Bendis book?
It's so funny. I brought this up. I was talking to Josh Williamson a couple of weeks ago in an interview, and I said to him, have you read Fortune and Glory? And we're like, that is the manual. Like, everyone in comics needs to read that and then realize that, as funny as it is 100% real. Like, everything in there, Brian's observations in there are gut-wrenchingly hilarious and painful in all the proper ways. Did you hear him talking about a line he was saying he should do a sequel? He said he could do a whole sequel just on the time that he spent working on as a consultant on Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark or whatever.
I knew he was a consultant on that, but that does genuinely sound.
But he's like, I could do an entire volume of Fortune and Glory just on that, let alone, like, I can't imagine a modern version of that Bendis now, like all the things he's been through. That would be an absolute scream.
I would love that. So I was thinking this morning literally about, Bendis has just drawn a cover for Matt's new indie book. And I'm like, awesome. I would love, and obviously Brian will not be drawing another book ever again, I suspect. I would love to see that again.
Well, it'd be a fun retirement kind of goal for him, just like putter away at a thing. That'd be amazing.
Yeah.
It'd be so good. I love that era of Bendis's stuff is so, there's something real, the truisms, like he's just unvarnished and he's kind of digging in and there's something very, very human and real about that book in particular, because it's not just characters, it's him and all the weird stuff he's dealing with. It's awesome.
See, I think about it all the time. And it's weirdly quite a good, as you said, it's a good training manual. That idea, these are things I should internalize.
Yes.
In that kind of this is actually genuinely experienced and actually.
No, I've had those moments. So that exact, when we hung out 2 years ago and then I went to LA, that was for me to do what we call the water bottle tour, where you're going from studio to studio and you're pitching your stuff. And it was so Bendis-y, like those, and I took comfort in the fact that there were just ludicrous moments where I go, yep, this is a complete waste of everyone's time, but I can step outside of my body and kind of enjoy it for its insanity, and then on to the next one and on to the next one. It was amazing. Yeah. Good stuff. Sweet. Excellent. It was a pleasure to chat with you.
Yeah, hopefully I will, speak soon, and thank you for anyone watching, etc.
Yeah, absolute pleasure.